Time now for part 2 of Your Agenda, tonight on men, maleness, and equality. Here is some of what you have written to us on this topic in the past little while. Reconstruct family law to generate a fairer system, writes one emailer. Honest men who have fallen into the Family Responsibility Office system are not being treated fairly. It is time for the family law to be adjusted to fit into the current times. And this from another emailer. The Toronto Transit Commission has a program called Request Stop, which permits female passengers to ask the bus driver to let them off the bus between regular stops. I thought I would be able to avail myself of the service. To my amazement and horror, the bus driver said the program was not for male passengers, and my request was denied. And finally, a third emailer weighed in today with this observation. As a woman, I have never been given a speeding violation ticket by any of the male police officers who have pulled me over. My ex, however, got more than his share. Well, our poll question for you tonight. Do you think in some circumstances men are discriminated against? Log on to our website at tvo.org/theagenda and vote. And joining us now on the debate, in Montreal, Catherine Young, author of Spreading Misandry. From the nation's capital in Ottawa, David Shackleton, editor of Grip magazine. With us here in studio, Ian Brown, host of TVO's own The View from Here, and Toronto criminal lawyer Walter Fox. Welcome one and all. We want to tell everybody that, as usual, being Thursday nights, we want to get your input, so please email your questions to us at theagenda@tvo.org, and we will do our best to get some of them to our guests tonight. Okay, let's go. Mr. Shackleton in Ottawa. Yes. If I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. It's a man's world, isn't it?
Well, I think it's always been a world that has served both men and women. And unfortunately, now we have focused in on how women have been advantaged, and or women have been disadvantaged and men have been advantaged. And that's a half of the story. It's a true half, but it's still only a half. It's also a woman's world.
Walter, what's the other half of the story that we're not as accustomed to hearing about in your view?
Well, some people think it's a dog's world. So I don't know where that phrase comes from, except possibly from an era when only men worked and women didn't. So men were out in the working world. Maybe that's what they meant by a men's world. And if you follow that through, it's well known, or sorry, it's not as well known as it ought to be, but when there are 700 people a year die on the job, 90% of those are men. That's a statistic you don't hear. Does that make it a man's world?
Catherine Young, you have written a book called Spreading Misandry. And I think we need to start by just having you define what misandry is. I know everybody seems to know what misogyny is, but I suspect very few people have heard the word misandry. So go ahead.
Well, it's really the sexual counterpart of misogyny. So misandry is contempt of men or hatred of men. And that's not an emotion such as anger, but it's a culturally cultivated stereotype.
Anger towards men from whom or by whom?
Well, anger towards men from women. So if we have contempt of men and hatred of men, that often comes from women, just as in the past, the contempt of women came from men. They're parallel concepts, in other words. Okay,
so when you talk about misandry, you're always talking about from women towards men, then?
I would think so, yes.
Okay. You know, Ian, I look in our houses of, political office. Parliament is overwhelmingly male. Queen's Park is overwhelmingly male. The courts, the same thing. I mean, if you look
really?
At the...
Hold on. Well, let's not say that about the courts.
Well,
over the last number of years...
Hang on, I was talking to Ian.
Well, okay, but this is something I know about.
Well, all right.
But go ahead,
Maybe I picked a bad example there, but the point I was trying to make, that if you look overwhelmingly at the major institutions of our society, engineering, there's another one, it always seems to be overwhelmingly dominated by men. Can you really say men are being discriminated against in this society?
I think you can say that men were discriminated against during the peak of the feminist revolution that began 30 years ago, 40 years ago now. I think you can clearly say that. I remember having a conversation when I was 30. A woman said, "Why do you work so hard?" "I work as a writer." And I said, "Well, I like working. I enjoy it." She said, "It's such a male thing and such an old-fashioned thing. Guys are stopping doing that." And I thought, yeah, I can't help that. That's like that. In any revolution, it's not really freedom that's passed along. They just shift the burden of oppression from one shoulder to another. And I think there was a lot of that in the early days of the women's movement. And it hangs over, and everything is politicized. So things are argued that way.
But I
think nowadays men, I think, have been liberated by the women's movement. I think we're freer now than we've ever been before. Freer, and we see it in our language and our stories.
David Shackleton in Ottawa wants to disagree.
Yes, I do. We talk about men dominating these areas where men are in the majority. It's not the same thing at all. You could look at women are in the majority in the supermarket. Does that mean that they dominate? We're in touch with who they're serving when women dominate or when women are in the majority. We realize that they're in a service role. Men are in a service role. Who are they serving?
Well, hang on. Can I just challenge you on that for a second? Hang on, David.
Let me finish. I go to service clubs, and I've tried to speak about men's issues, and they don't want to hear them. They're full of men, and yet they say we are serving women and children. So that's men serving.
Okay, but let me push you a little bit on this, because I'm not sure how far we want to push this analogy of the floor of a supermarket to the floor of the House of Commons. I mean, admittedly, hang on, Walter. Okay, admittedly, there is a service element to politics, of course, but let's not forget about the wielding of power that surely is far more significant on the floor of the House than it is on the floor of Loblaws. Don't you think?
I agree it is. There's more power there. And who are they serving? The assumption is that if men are there, they must be serving men's interests. But that isn't the case.
Okay.
I keep wanting to say, well, weren't men discriminated against during the First World War when they were killed by the millions in the trenches, in the Second World War, and so on? I mean, men were dominant there too, but they were getting killed.
Those are ancient complaints of masculinity. I mean, for millions of years, encoded in our genes is the role of the man, which is to stand with his back to the fire, his arms linked with his pals, while the women and children, because they have the children, I'm still at this point, are sitting around the fire. You don't, as a result of that, you don't talk about your feelings or your ideas or thoughts, because it's distracting and somebody will jump out and eat you.
Well, that's a pretty simplistic concept,
since the development of feminism, and seriously, since the widespread acceptance of feminism, since the fact that women now, occupy in Quebec at the moment, for instance, 75 and 80% of the opening places in medical school, 65% of the places in law schools. So, I mean, that is real equality. And that has set men off to be able to, have this conversation. If we had this conversation on TV 30 years ago, we'd be shot tomorrow by all the guys in our friends.
You couldn't have had this conversation up until now. And this conversation flowed from, as I understand it, has come from a conversation where feminism was discussed by 5 women on this very station. No men. Men are not allowed to discuss feminism. Men are only now, in this station, in this show, for the first time that I know of, men are sitting around discussing what's happened to men. Usually it's women discussing what happened to women in feminism and what's happened to men as well.
I must say, Walter, they were all better behaved and didn't scream at each other as much. Am I allowed to observe that? Catherine Young, let me bring you back in here. Your choice of specialty is interesting, in as much as I guess we would not expect a woman to be interested in the pursuits of misandry. What drew you to this?
Well, I started out really studying women. Like many women of my age in the early 70s, we wondered what that silent history was all about, and we began to do research on it. And I still do that kind of research, but I realize that's only half of the problem, that we really need to look at men, not with the stereotypes of male power, but what men's real lives are like, what the silent history of men has been over the centuries, and we need to develop a stereoscopic vision where we have both women's input and men's input in order to get some depth to our understanding of history.
Okay, help us understand it. How is misandry spread?